Hi, everyone. I'm Gonzalez. I'm here at Lowell Observatory, and thank you for joining us for another Lowell42. If you are joining us for the first time for Lowell42, what these are a special type of lecture that sort of tackles these unanswerable or really big questions. And the namesake Lowell42 actually comes from a Douglas Adams book. If you remember, 42 was the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Sort of a play on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So of course we can't find answers to everything in the universe. But we found out through all of our interactions with you guys when we were here looking through telescopes at night, some of the questions you would ask were just so big and so unanswerable. Like, is there life out there? What happens when you get too close to a black hole? Some of these questions require a lot of thought, and we thought it would be great to design an entire lecture series around these types of questions. And so Lowell42 was born. So I'm hoping everyone's out there being safe. And if you're at home joining us, get that warm cup of coffee. And I have the pleasure of introducing someone who has been a friend of mine for, I guess, the entire time I've been here, which has been over 10 years, Dr. Klaus Brasch. He was standing out there with me in the telescope, with the telescopes out in the cold, and we would talk for hours about some of these things. He comes to us as a retired bioscientist, so we get the biology perspective, and we're going to tackle this question tonight. Klaus is going to tackle this question tonight, something that we revisit all the time. I played off that title there, Klaus. Is there life out there? Life in the Cosmos Revisited. And so, Klaus, could you go ahead and take it away from here? Can you explain to us this topic, Life in the Cosmos Revisited? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Todd, for that nice introduction. And I'm sure I will have every answer that anybody ever wanted to know about life in the universe, which at this point actually is nothing, because we don't know if there's any other life in the universe. So I'd like to welcome you all, and I hope you enjoy the little cartoon on the left here. That's one of these supposed reasons why the dinosaurs didn't make it. Anyhow, all jokes aside, one of the main driving forces behind many of the missions that NASA and other worldwide space agencies are thriving to go for is basically astrobiology, or the new term of a new science that combines astronomy and biology in the search for life in other systems, possibly. And if we look at just a few that are being shown here, here is one of the ones that might be sent to Saturn's big, beautiful moon Titan, which has a very thick atmosphere and weird biochemistry, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another possible lander will be on Jupiter's moon Europa, which is one of the most interesting moons we have in our solar system. And then, of course, there's always Mars. And as we are speaking now, there are at least 3 landers that have been sent that are on the way to Mars, in part to look for biosignatures or some evidence of past life on Mars. And finally, on the big picture, exobiology, astrobiologists and astronomers looking for exoplanets. As you know, we have now discovered in excess of 4,000 planets around other stars, and some of them are actually Earth-like in size, notably the TRAPPIST system, which I'll talk a little bit about later on too. But some of these Earth-like planets might also harbor life. And so astronomers are trying to find ways and means of detecting what they call biosignatures. And I'll come around a little bit later and talk about that too. Now, before we can do this, however, there are many, many unanswered questions in this particular area of science. For instance, despite the fact that we have studied now life on our own planet for basically ever since day one that we can remember as humans, we still haven't come up with a decent definition of life. Now, you may think, well, that should be easy. After all, if you have a cat, that's alive, and if there's a rock, that's dead, that's not alive. But that's really not a decent formal definition of life. It's a very hard thing to define. And then, supposing we end up going to Mars or another planet and actually find life there, but it's very different from our life. So how would we define life that's based on other forms or other chemistries? Big question there. Now, Earth-based life, or the only forms of life that we know so far, are based essentially on the element carbon. And so everything that has living properties involves the element carbon, because carbon is a very reactive and very common atom that can form many, many complicated molecular links with others in biochemistry and so forth. And so the basis then of always the life that we'll be looking for initially would be like life here on Earth, which is basically carbon and water-based. But there might also be other biochemistries that we haven't even thought about. Now, the other thing that we are not sure about is how and when did life arise here on Earth, let alone elsewhere. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Some people have argued that life is a natural byproduct of planetary system formation. And that's a possibility, but we really, again, don't know. And then the other question is life widespread in the universe, or is it rare? Obviously, that has great implications for many things that we'll be looking for as we proceed further out into the exploration of our solar system and elsewhere. And then, if there is life, would life be simple forms like we have here on Earth, bacteria and worms and insects, or advanced life forms, including, of course, mammals and ourselves? And then there's the question that some people have argued that the Earth is special. So we'll be addressing parts or all of these questions throughout this talk. Now, just a brief look back. The question of life elsewhere has been really out there since the Greek days. As soon as people were aware of what was going on, more or less not having the scientific information, but the question popped up repeatedly. Is the moon inhabited? Is Mars inhabited? Even before we had any idea what their chemistry, geology, and other things were. The ancients asked themselves those questions. And then in the 17th century, a very interesting book was written by this French scientist, which essentially is titled Discussions on the Plurality of the Worlds. And that was something that stemmed from a philosophical underpinning at the time, that God did not create anything without purpose, and therefore all other worlds must be inhabited. And that literally went to the point where scientists and philosophers and others in those times believed that the moon was inhabited, that every world, every planet, and every other planet that might be out there would be inhabited, because otherwise it would be a waste in terms of what God had created. And in addition, all of this fit very nicely with Newton's theory of gravity, because it explained the orbits of the planets and the sun. It explained things like weight and gravity and so forth. And it all made perfectly good sense, in sense that people then thought the universe worked like clockwork. It was regular, it was predictable, and it made sense. A little bit later, that began to be questioned, because especially in the 1700s, when basically the first geologist, if we can call him that, James Hutton, put forth a theory of uniformitarianism. And what does that mean? Well, he argued that the physical, chemical, and biological laws that operated in our geologic past do so to this day. That had never been accepted before. Everybody thought, because essentially everyone accepted broadly that what the biblical suggestion was, that everything was created about 10,000 years ago within a week, according to Genesis. And beginning at this time, there was the start of some questioning of that. And then in 1830, Charles Lyell combined these ideas into the principles of geology and managed to show that the Earth has to be way, way older than 10,000 years, and in fact had to be millions of years old. And that naturally caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised. And it also set the stage for Charles Darwin's work, and I'll describe a bit of that in a minute. So by the time the 19th century came around, you had Charles Darwin publishing The Origins of the Species and the Theory of Evolution. He basically argued that life had existed on our planet for a very long time and was constantly interconnected and constantly changing over time. And what's particularly interesting as well is around that same time, German physician Hermann Richter argued, and who knows how he got this idea, that life is an intrinsic property of the cosmos and is transported in space on small rocky fragments, which contains dormant microorganisms that could act like seeds. And they would then evolve into complex organisms if they hit a suitable planet like the Earth. Now, this was a very radical idea at the time, as you can imagine. What had also happened at that time is a brilliant scientist, Louis Pasteur, the term pasteurization of milk, for example, is thanks to him. He did too, among many other things. He proved for the first time without question that life did not just pop out of nowhere, but that life was a continuous sequence of reproduction and distribution, and that was called the germ theory of life. In other words, the tree of life was interconnected all the way back to the very beginning of when life did appear on the Earth. And then the 20th century kind of capped all of this in more modern terms. In 1953, as many of you may remember or know, James Watson, Francis Crick, and Rosalind Russell finally clarified the structure of DNA. It was known by then that DNA is our genetic material, is the chemical way in which our genes are carried from one cell to the next, but nobody had figured out yet what the molecule looked like, and these three people finally did that. So we now know that DNA is a double helix. We know that it is a ladder-shaped structure, and we know that it consists of a series of nitrogenous bases which define the code of our genes. A very important discovery. Around the same time again, in an effort to find out more about how life actually appeared on Earth, Harold Urey and Stanley Miller did a seminal experiment that's described in this following slide. They argued that the primitive Earth, before there was life in fossils or anything that we've discovered, that the life, of course, is built of many, many complex molecules, but the basic molecules that every protein and every animal and plant body is made of is amino acids. And so what they were interested in seeing, can amino acids be created just through chemistry in what would have been the early Earth system? And so they built this Rube Goldberg machine, but a very clever design, essentially mimicking what they thought the chemistry of the atmosphere and water of the early Earth must have been like. So they built this sterile apparatus, so you can see a picture of it here, They would boil water and that would turn into water vapor and then circulate into the atmosphere, just as we now know the water cycle is in our planet. And then they built 2 electrodes in here so that they could have a spark discharge, which would be akin to lightning. And then the water vapor would be cooled again and turn into liquid water and recycled. And they would run this machine for several hours. Now, what they did was to then throw in these basic chemicals, methane, ammonia, water, and hydrogen, and just run the thing. And even after a few hours, here at the bottom, they would collect a mushy, dark-colored, goopy, all the way to describe it, combination of things. And they realized that they had now created almost all of the key amino acids that we know proteins contain. So that was seen as a major, major step in trying to understand how life formed first. Since that time, many, many hundreds of experiments along similar lines have been done, and we've been able to synthesize the precursors of RNA, of DNA, of crude proteins, and even cellular components independently. So that has led then to a better, clearer idea of what might have gone on Earth way back when. And so in terms of where and how might life have formed along these lines, Charles Darwin had actually proposed the warm pond hypothesis, basically an alphabet soup of organic precursors. And then it was formalized later in the 1920s by Operin and Haldane. And the idea was that life arose by progressive chemical evolution from simple to complex organic molecules in a water's or aqueous setting. The proviso was that there would be no free oxygen in any of this, because oxygen oxidizes things and would very quickly break down any organics. And then today it's considered that this type of thing might also have occurred in deep ocean vents. So let's look a little bit at some of the experimental kind of evidence that is available in support of these ideas. What you can see here is a picture of a microscopic image of what's termed a protocell. A student way back when we used to do experiments like these. And basically, if you've ever dropped oil into water, you will see these roundish blobs or circular structures appearing. And that's because oil and water don't mix, and oil will, in fact, form a barrier to keep water out and trap water inside. And if you then combine lipids or fat molecules, they'll all do the same thing because they're called hydrophobic, they don't like water. You can then build membranous-looking structures like these. And so the theory goes that in those early days, you had double-layered membrane of lipid and protein, with water outside, water inside, and then molecules like RNA and DNA could form inside these cellular or protocellular situations. And eventually the idea was then, like bacteria do today, that these would multiply by splitting into 2 and distributing their genomes into the daughter cells and so forth. Now, this is a great simplistic idea, but really we don't know because we've not been able all the way. So the standard model of cellular evolution on Earth, at least, is the following. You begin with organic precursors that might have been synthesized on Earth, or as we now know, very likely also came from external sources, because we've discovered organic precursors in cometary material, in asteroids. We've detected organics all the way out into the interstellar medium, and even some of the clouds that will eventually form planetary, solar planetary systems, etc. In other words, it's pretty easy to synthesize in space under the right conditions all kinds of organic small precursor molecules. The next step would then be that some of these molecules, like RNA, would form and they can self-replicate. This has been done in a laboratory with great success. And then if you throw in a membranous mixture kind of thing, then you can actually have these protocellular or pre-cell type structures forming that can split in two and divide their genomes in two and so on and so forth. And then according to theory, and this is where there's a big, big gap right here, the true cells would form from these kinds of mixtures, and the ones that are most successful would survive. And eventually you would end up with modern cells where in fact RNA is replaced by DNA since they're complementary, and DNA is much more stable as a carrier of genetic information than RNA is. So where? Well, two possibilities. One, as I've mentioned before, people have suggested that this might have taken place in hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. There you have both heat from the magma of the hot interior of the Earth. You have a whole bunch of appropriate molecules, water, hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, etc., that will all be precursors to make organic molecules, and the heat would provide a lot of the energy to forge these bonds between these molecules. So that's one scenario. The other one is back to the warm pond idea. And as you can see in this picture, these are structures known as stromatolites. They're really interesting. They're structures that are in the intertidal zone here, for example. These are perhaps 2 or 3 feet or even larger in diameter, and they're in the intertidal zone of the west coast of Australia in Shark Bay, but also a few other places on Earth. They're incredibly interesting for the following reasons. As you can see here is a mass of goopy mass taken from one of these living stromatolites. And what you'll notice here is they're striated. You see here layer after layer. These are like rings on a tree. With each season, growth season, you get another layer and another layer. These layers contain every conceivable bacteria and algae, etc., that exists today, and they will form a large community of microbes. And sunlight drives them photosynthetically and so forth. Then you look at this one. This is actually a fossil stromatolite that has been dated to being 3.5 billion years old. And you see they haven't changed appreciably. And in other words, this is one of the earliest forms of life on Earth, very likely. And that also indicates something which can present a bit of a problem, namely that life gained a foothold on Earth when the Earth was very, very young. So we're still then faced with two conundrums, really. For example, here you see we don't know how we went from molecules to protocells to real cells. We don't know that yet. And to give you an idea that that's not just a simple step, here's an electron microscope picture of the simplest microorganisms we know, and that's Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which is one of the organisms that causes pneumonia. And down here, you have electron micrographs of E. coli, a bacterium that we all know very well because it lives in our guts and everywhere else. And this is not the true color. These have been colorized. But what you can see is how sophisticated these cells are. These are not just protocells. They can move around. They have little flagella that allows them to travel through the liquid medium. They have a distinctive cell wall with external feelers. They have their own DNA, very nice coiled DNA, and they have their entire machinery to make proteins, to catch energy, and to reproduce, and as they do very quickly and very easily. So the jump from protocell to this cell is not a trivial step. And then the next step was the evolution of photosynthesis. As you can see here, some microorganisms that are green. That was important because, as we all know, trees and green plants in general, as well as other plants, they make sugars and energy, and in the process release oxygen. That was important because oxygen will go into our atmosphere and become ozone high up in high layers and provide us with a protective shield against the intense ultraviolet radiation from sunlight, which is quite detrimental to life in general. So these two things had to happen quite close together. So to sum it all up, this complicated picture, the Earth, the solar system essentially is thought to have formed around 4.5 billion years ago. The first 500 million years or so, the Earth was still mostly molten magma, too hot, and there was constant bombardment as the very planetesimals formed with the process of accretion. And it wasn't until about 4 billion years ago that the Earth probably was cool enough, in fact, for there to be liquid water and other things. And that's probably when the first life appeared. Now, the oldest ones we have on record so far are the stromatolites, 3.5 billion years, but there are others now that people think it may go back as far as almost 4 billion years, where we find fossil organisms. So in short, very early on, life appeared. But then it took the rest of all of this time to modern day, as life first microbial, then oxygen was released, then you had, as I said, the ozone layer to shield us from ultraviolet, and then we go through a whole series of other steps before plants and animals could be on land, and then complex animals, etc., etc. So it's been a very slow and protracted process to go from the beginning of life to today's situation. So when and where did it start? Well, we still don't know. Here are a couple of comical suggestions. Maybe polyester was involved, or maybe a miracle took place between matter and life. So we must always keep in mind that there are many things we don't know yet in science, and slowly we will get there. All right. Now, what options does that leave us in terms of life in the cosmos? And as I mentioned, life on Earth arose rapidly from organic is one possibility. The other one is that life is ubiquitous in the cosmos, that's been around for a very, very long time, and seeded the young Earth and other bodies in the solar system. Or third, a combination of the two. So let's address these in a little more detail. The term panspermia, which was first suggested by the ancient Greeks, means essentially seeds, distribution, seeds everywhere. And in 1908, the chemist Svante Arrhenius proposed a theory that it might be possible to test that spores of living organisms, or perhaps frozen organisms, could travel through space due to radiation pressure from the stars. And this is the idea here. In space, you have a vacuum, and even sunlight can push a very small or a large object through space gradually. And he proposed that maybe tiny specks of dust could house bacteria, which would then seed the primitive young Earth or any other planet and perhaps bring life to them. There is essentially, as we pursue this type of mechanism as a potential source for life, is we could have random transport by stellar radiation, which I just outlined. We could have transports within rocks or ejecta from one planet to another, or even from one star system to another. And we'll look at those two in a minute. And finally, there is the possibility that there is directed or purposeful propagation by some advanced civilization. Let's look at each one of these in a little more detail. For the one that has the most credibility at this point is what's called lithospat and rocks, or meteorites or asteroid chunks or whatever. And the idea is that when the Earth and Mars were forming, for example, early on in the solar system, let's say 3.5 billion years ago, when they were now beginning to form their planetary bodies, there was still an awful lot of bombardment going on because of the massive amounts of material that kept crashing into each other in the solar system. And of course, we see evidence of that on the moon. If we look at if you look at pictures and images of the moon, it's just peppered with impact craters, because that's basically how much that sort of thing happened. There's less of that happening today, but it continues. We also know that we have identified at least 100 to 150 meteorites that probably originated on Mars. They're similar in chemistry to Mars. And that means, of course, that something must have hit Mars at some point, ejected parts of that material into space, and eventually it landed on Earth and other places in the solar system. Similarly, the young Earth might have been hit, probably absolutely hit, and so that then we have perhaps, and we haven't discovered any on Mars yet, but then there might be Earth originating meteorites, and reversal kind of thing. So the idea here is that as scientists are beginning to realize, one of the interesting things about Mars is that although today liquid water cannot exist on its surface for any length of time, in the past, say 3 billion years ago, Mars probably had a much denser atmosphere than it does today, and consequently it would trap more heat. And we also know that Mars has an awful lot of frozen ice underneath its surface and a little bit in its polar caps. So perhaps at that time there was actually liquid water on Mars. And if we look at many of the satellite images now that are coming back, and also why we have rovers on Mars, is to trace some of these potentially once water channels on the surface of Mars, looking for biosignatures and other things of that sort. So that's one possibility of indeed finding something. Now, the other thing, astrobiologists are really excited because astronomers just recently, you might have read about that, just recently discovered a compounds called phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. Now, this has really excited people because Venus is one of the few planets in our solar system that's almost a twin for the Earth in terms of size. However, it's closer to the sun, and it's covered by very thick, dense clouds, mostly composed of carbon dioxide, so it traps heat. And really, it's more like hell rather than a decent, cool planet that would be conducive to life. And still, these molecules, phosphines, which consist of carbon and phosphate, were detected recently in the atmosphere of Venus. And that is interesting because phosphines are also byproducts of many microbial chemical reactions. So the question is, are there microbes in the atmosphere of Venus? Who knows? Even good old Pluto, way out there at the edge of the solar system, as you may have seen in the pictures and also in the reports from when New Horizons flew by, we were shocked to discover that it has a very interesting and active surface, and it's covered by this brownish material, which turns out to be massive conglomerations of carbon compounds, giving it this brown coloration. And tholins are also compounds that appear here on Earth. They're usually the sort of end products of biochemical reactions or biological degradation. why would they be on Pluto is certainly a tantalizing question. And the most interesting bodies in the solar system right now for possibility of there being life, microbial life at least, are some of the outer moons of our solar system, notably Enceladus, which is one of the moons of Saturn, and it is really interesting. Of Jupiter in that case, and these are called water worlds because it was determined by the Cassini and the Galileo missions to these outer planets that they're covered in ice and that they have the correct density, that under this ice there might be a rather substantial ocean, body of water. And here's one of the images that the Cassini mission did of Enceladus, because it has these spouts or these icy jets coming out of the south pole of this moon. And when Cassini flew through this, they actually detected organics in these plumes, which makes it incredibly interesting. And we'll be going back there, I'm sure, before too long, and especially to Europa as well. And so the speculation is there might be life here. Perhaps these plumes contain organics because perhaps there's life like we have in our deep subsurface ocean vents. Here's an animated image of that, where the heat of the Earth is in fact causing life. This is all living organisms around these vents. So perhaps that's what we'll find on these moons, which would certainly be exciting. So then the question is, let's say we do find life on at least perhaps just fossil life, perhaps more than that on a place like Mars, for example, or elsewhere in the solar system. Why is this such an important question? Well, among other things, it suggests that life is universal and can arise anywhere conditions are favorable, be that on a moon or on a planet, and who knows where else, asteroids perhaps. It also implies that complex life is possible, even if we only discover simple life on Mars, for example, bacteria and so on. And the fact is that that's what most of the life on Earth is. That might then indicate that, however, after some long period of time, if life existed on Mars or other bodies, that complex life might also appear elsewhere. Then here's an interesting question that if we do find living or even fossil Martians, the question then is, are these DNA, RNA, and protein based like all life on Earth? And if so, that implies that there is a common ancestry, perhaps, maybe through panspermia, as I discussed a little earlier, exchange or cross-contamination during the early stages of our solar system. If the Martians are not largely DNA, RNA, and protein based, but has different types of biochemistries and different types of genetic systems, then that would suggest that they have independent origins, which would also be a fascinating, interesting thing. So either way, it would raise countless more questions, obviously, than we are presently in a position to answer. Now, taking this even further, some scientists have argued that you might even have interstellar panspermia, or in other words, life exchange between adjacent solar systems. And this would complete science fiction until relatively recently. You may have recalled a couple of years ago that a interloper entered the solar system, a large cometary or asteroidal-like body that came way, way out of the solar system, swept around the sun rather quickly, and then went back out again to who knows where. This was given the name of Oumuamua. And the point is that if this happened right now, as we've seen it, then there's no reason that this hasn't happened many, many times in the past as well. And what makes that really interesting is the following. As you can see in these rather busy diagrams here, you've all heard of asteroids, and we all have at Lowell and many other observatories have been looking for asteroids that might at some point impact the Earth or cause problems. And most of those are from the asteroid belt, which is really leftover material from the early solar system that never condensed, coalesced into planets. And most of these are beyond the orbit of Mars and between the orbit of Jupiter. However, there's also outside of the solar system another group of these types of early unused, let's say, leftover parts of our protostar system called the Kuiper belt. And a number of comets can come from there. And in fact, the explanation as to why Pluto is such a different body compared to the other planets, the regular planets, and why it was demoted from a planet to a minor planet is that it may be a captured Kuiper belt object. And then beyond even that, on the very outskirts of the sun, is a third type of cloud of leftover material called the Oort cloud. By the way, Kuiper and Oort were two famous astronomers that first suggested that these bodies are out there. And the Oort cloud actually extends way past, we haven't actually seen or measured it, but in theory it extends way past the sun, almost a third of the way from our system towards the nearest star system, if the Centauri combination, Alpha, Beta, Proxima Centauri. And if that system also has its own Oort cloud, then over time, as all these stars move and circle our galaxy, there's bound to have been close encounters at some point, and perhaps there was then an exchange of meteorites or microorganisms or what have you. So people are thinking in much, much broader terms now about the possibility of panspermia. Again, none of this is proven, but it is beginning to be questions that we can ask meaningfully and hope to get an answer somewhere down the line. The problems with all of this speculation about panspermia and so on is, of course, the huge interstellar distances, the ionizing radiation that would easily destroy living organisms, and the extreme ranges in temperature, and, of course, the deep vacuum of space. Could anything survive that? Could any organism survive that? And it turns out that, yes, maybe they could. And what would that be? Well, there are a number of things that we have here on Earth called extremophiles. These are bacteria or life forms that can withstand outrageously different and inclement environments. For example, if you've ever been to hot springs somewhere, and in many cases, there are in fact bacteria that can live to very, very high temperatures. They can live to extremely salty environments. And acidic environments and so forth. So maybe that type of organism could really have been part of a panspermia situation. And so what's so special about extremophiles? Well, to give you just a couple of examples, dinococcus radiolans was only discovered at the beginning of the atomic age when we started building nuclear reactors. And people were shocked to discover, because everybody thought, anything would be fried inside a nuclear reactor. But these bacteria were discovered when crews went in after decommissioning a nuclear reactor and started cleaning it up. They found these organisms. And lo and behold, they can tolerate radiation 1,000 times greater than humans and most other organisms. And why is that? Well, these bacteria, you see 4 of them, are just in the process of dividing. They actually have 4 copies of their genomes. We only have 1 of ours. They have 4 because if the radiation destroys part of their genome in one of them, they always have a backup copy to be able to use again, or to then, repair the existing ones that have been damaged. So very, very clever organisms. And then many bacteria have what is called endospores. When the temperatures or chemical damage or other bad things happen, these bacteria will not reproduce. They will simply undergo synthesis of an outer coat, and the bacterium itself inside will essentially become almost like a fossilized structure and do nothing. It'll be desiccated and frozen. And then when conditions get better again, like the temperature goes up or the environment that they're in has more water or whatever, then they come back to life. And perhaps the most interesting of all of these critters are the so-called tardigrades. These are microscopic little things, also called waterbearers. They're so tiny that they are not much bigger than our human cells, for example, and they're everywhere. They're in our hair follicles, they're on our skin, they're inside our body and outside, and every other animal has these things. And some of these were taken to the International Space Station to study in terms of survival. And some species can withstand temperatures of -300 up to well over the boiling point of water, 150 or so Fahrenheit, but also in Celsius terms. They can survive the vacuum of space, they can survive total desiccation and high radiation. And these are full animals. Here's the head, the mouth, and legs, only they're tiny, tiny. So who knows what they can withstand or could withstand in any sort of panspermia type situation. And finally, I want to just briefly address before we continue with the rest of the talk, is what about directed panspermia? In other words, what if there's some advanced civilization that really wants to send stuff out and see if they can somehow target another solar system or something with organisms of their own? This was first written up in 1930 in a novel by British science fiction writer Olaf Stapleton. And everybody thought, yeah, sure. Well, in the 1970s, Francis Crick of DNA fame and Leslie Orgel, both famous scientists, took a serious look at this possibility. And they asked the question, if it does happen, why would an advanced civilization want to do this? It seems in a way, kind of silly. On the other hand, who knows? Well, if the technical superiority of an advanced civilization, they might get bored and say, well, let's try panspermia and see if we can contaminate a nearby solar system or something like that. They just have the urge to explore other solar systems. They may be a dying civilization seeking new homes, or, another great planet somewhere. They might have some sort of missionary zeal to spread their own solar system's life throughout the cosmos. And again, of course, the problem is vast interstellar distances, no known technology. And as you approach the speed of light, unlike what Star Trek tells you, warp factor is not easy to achieve. And so one has serious relativistic effects. But guess what? There's always an entrepreneur or somebody who is willing to give it a try. And entrepreneur Yuri Milner, who many of you may know as one of the richest people in the world, he recently committed $100 million towards a proof of concept project. And he wants to use a tiny fleet of light sails. Here's an image of what they might look like. That would be driven by laser or solar radiation away from our solar system and eventually reach about 20% the speed of light, which would be very fast, much faster than any rocket ships, for instance, that we could imagine. The target would be Proxima Centauri, which is the closest star to us, and we know is home to Earth-sized planets. And if this happens, it could be reached within about a generation, or roughly 60 to 70 years. Again, none of this has happened yet, but it's an interesting concept that's being looked at. Now, changing approach completely, in a rather shocking book written in 1999 by Ward and Brownlee, they proposed the rare earth hypothesis. And their argument goes something like this. Bacterial life forms are probably very common in the cosmos, but intelligent life is most likely rare. Why? Well, despite our apparent Goldilocks situation, in other words, the Earth seems to be perfectly, made for life and us over the years of its existence, it still took 3.5 billion years from the origin of life before humans emerged. Humans being technologically advanced inhabitants. So because we only appeared this recently, they argue that efforts like SETI, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is highly improbable and would also explain the paradox that the famous physicist posed many years ago. If there are aliens, intelligent aliens out there, where are they? If they exist, technologically advanced civilizations are likely to be few and far between, is what these authors argued. And this is something we can talk about later if you like. Any thoughts about it? So then the question is the Earth a Goldilocks situation? In other words, is it really that unusual, as these guys argue? And here's what they propose as proof. First of all, we've been circling our sun, a stable star, which has been we've been around it for some 4 billion years, but it's going to be stable for another 4 or 5 billion years. In other words, about 10 billion years. That's a very long period of time. We live on a rocky, water-rich planet. We have a strong magnetic field. Not all planets have that. That minimizes radiation from the sun that could harm life. We're living in the galactic safe zone, whereby there are very few nearby supernovae, which could easily eradicate life anywhere as well because of the force of radiation coming from a supernova when a star explodes. We have a large moon, which limits our wobble over our axis. In other words, keeps the Earth spinning stably, more or less. We have tectonic activity because we have continents, and that tectonic activity churns the surface of the planet and stimulates evolution. We have Jupiter in our solar system, far enough from us to help clear some of the primordial debris, which would otherwise still be bombarding us as it did early on. And we've had multiple mass extinctions to spur an evolutionary change on Earth. And they argue of over the 4,000 exoplanetary systems discovered so far, very few resemble ours. So this would make things appear fairly bleak in terms of whether there are other advanced civilizations on other planets. So let's look at the reality of the situation. The question is, are Earth-like or life-supporting planets in our galaxy common and rare? Well, it's obviously too early to tell because of the estimated 200 to 300 billion stars in our galaxy. All we've examined so far is a few thousand, which is, of course, a minuscule fraction. Is the Earth really so unusual that complex life could only develop and last here? Too early to tell, since we only have a sample of one, namely us. We haven't been to Mars. We haven't been to other places to see if there is life. We also can't contemplate other life forms. There might well be advanced civilizations that are robotic or advanced artificial intelligence or synthetic forms All of that is sort of within the grasp of what we're doing now. So is the Earth unique? Most scientists don't think so. For one reason is that Mother Nature does not like flukes or propagate them to any extent, and we would certainly be a fluke if the arguments that the rare Earth hypothesis proposes were true. Also, the Earth is unique as it is in large measure because there is life here on it. If you really want to get carried away, there's this book I can highly recommend. It's called Imagined Life, and it looks at fascinating speculations of life as we don't know it. The question is, among other things that they raise, is carbon-based life like us evolves naturally and then creates machines with artificial intelligence and lifelike aspects, maybe? There could be non-carbon-based life, for example, silicon-based, although that seems unlikely for reasons we can't go into now. They even argue that life might form just as an electromagnetic force. These guys really get carried away, but it's all legitimate because they're very serious scientists. And then there might be whole planet-based integrated life. As some of you might know, there's this hypothesis called the Gaia hypothesis that says the entire planet Earth is one giant organism that's in balance with a variety of things. So this is a fun book to read. Now, what about SETI, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? Well, as the question is, where are they? We've been at it for a long time, trying to listen to radio signals from other potentially advanced civilizations. And of course, we have so far found nothing. What about it then? Well, when Frank Drake and others in the 1960s proposed searching for signals from advanced civilizations, they decided to use radio microwave signals of a narrow wavelength because everybody thought that would be the most reasonable signal to transmit or receive advanced radio signals from an technologically advanced civilization. The search continues today. It's much more sophisticated with larger antennas, multi-channel, and also laser bursts to look for optical signals with optical telescopes. Still, despite some false alarms over the decades, nothing so far. But when we also have to remember that it is technically extremely difficult, since there is a near infinite possibility of a number of potential targets and wavelength options. And the main issue is we have no idea what the lifespan of any alien advanced civilization might be. And do they care to transmit, and how many are out there, et cetera, et cetera. After all, we've not been able to do this except for the past 50 to 100 years. Enter Yuri Miller again. He is now given $100 million in funding and thousands of hours of dedicated telescope time at state-of-the-art facilities, including radio telescopes and optical telescopes. So that's an exciting new venture. And finally, could there be alternate light forms? For example, a well-known paleontologist years ago at a conference that I attended where they were talking about the interaction with the asteroid that wiped out most life on Earth. And he suggested if that hadn't happened, could intelligent life have popped up through the reptilian line of things? Or other possibilities, might life on a planet of lower gravity than ours exist? Or might life exist, intelligent life floating in an atmosphere, for example? Or if you've ever seen the movie Arrival, other options have come around. So intelligent life, well, who knows? If we had get wiped out or wipe ourselves out, could intelligent life evolve again on Earth? Maybe. How about robotic and artificial intelligent life in our future? And it certainly is. Or, well, maybe not so intelligent life as well. So here we are at the end of the conversation. I love this quote by English astronomer Peter Cox: "Life is the means by which the universe understands itself." So that's the end of my talk, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Klaus, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. And I just was reminded the whole time, I only got to do this once, but I remember one time after a night of viewing on the Rotunda Plaza, we went out for a glass of wine and we would talk about this kind of stuff. And
right,
I just love these conversations. And so I do have a couple of questions for you. And before I ask Book Davies' question, I wanted to set that question up first. And there are two camps, really, that I at least know, and about viruses. Are they life or are they not life? Are they living things? Are they not living things? And I kind of wanted to see where you stand as a bioscientist about viruses, since they've gotten a lot of attention, especially this year.
Oh yeah.
What's your thought on that?
Well, viruses continue to be really rather enigmatic, because viruses cannot reproduce or live by themselves. They have to infect a host organism. And so many scientists really say that they are rogue or parasitic genetic elements. They don't have cells, they're tiny molecular things. And if you just leave them sitting on a plate, they're not going to go anywhere. But they are definitely part of life on Earth, because every organism we know, from bacteria on up, is infected by viruses. And in fact, viruses do have some advantages or benefits, let's say, by introducing mobile genetic elements that can jump from one species to another. So they're definitely part of nature, and they're part of the biome on Earth, but they're not independent living creatures.
That's an interesting answer. And here's Book Davies' questions. It's sort of a two-parter, and you've sort of answered the first bit. Book Davies says, so I imagine the first viruses evolving as kind of a parasite. Would that be the right idea? And the second part of the question was, where would viruses fit into the evolutionary process? Would we put them there at all?
Yes, actually we would. In fact, they are, as we're now discovering, they are very much part of the evolutionary complexity. For example, let's just say in a very sort of brutal way, for instance, let's say a virus infects a certain type of animal, whether it's us or whether it's butterflies or horses or whatever, and kills a majority of them. What's left, however, then would be resistant to that virus, and they would be better fit in other ways than we were, or those that die. And nature is not cruel, nor is it good-hearted. It just works, and evolution is such that only those who are most adaptable survive. And in this context, if you are not killed by the virus, whether that's humans or any other animal, then you survive it. And if you are killed, you don't. That means you're out of the gene pool for future generations. So you see, it's actually a biological and evolutionary selection mechanism. A rather nasty one, but that's what it is, yes.
Yeah. We have a question from Keith Holinsky, who says, Dr. Brasch, do you feel we as a species are capable of truly comprehending and appreciating our place in the whole cosmos, even if we aren't the only ones here?
That's a great question. I love those kinds of questions. Well, the thing is, if you look at my quote here from Peter Cox, life is the means by which the universe understands itself. And I think that there's a lot of merit to that because, prior to our appearance on the Earth, many of the primates and many of the other intelligent animals, like whales and so on, it's highly unlikely that they would ever have contemplated their own existence in a cosmic sense because they just weren't equipped to do that. Plus, they were way, way too busy just staying alive, reproducing, fending off prey or enemies. And the one thing that we have going for us as humans is that we discovered things like agriculture and tools. And essentially that then made it possible for us to have leisure time because we didn't have to go hunting all the time. We didn't have to look over our backs all the time. And so the leisure time then got certainly the ancient civilizations from Mesopotamia to Greece to Egypt. Then a handful of people there could start looking up at the sky and saying, wow, are we alone? What's the meaning of life? Are the gods against us or for us? And so forth. In other words, philosophizing. And then when we discovered the scientific method, which really began around the time that Galileo was around, and then we started actually being able to ask questions that we could answer based on data and experimentation. And I think we're just on that progression right now. And I really envy young people today because many of the questions that I've posed directly and indirectly in my talk, we're on the cusp of being able to answer. And if we really do find that life is ubiquitous in the cosmos, just imagine how that would change our perception of who we are and our perception of what the universe might or might not be all about and so forth. So I think the answer to that great question is yes. I think in time we will. Now there's a proviso to that. I'm convinced, given with all the developments in things like genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and more robotics and so forth, that 100 years from now, we may no longer be the human beings that we recognize as ourselves, but we may be hybrids, we may be cyborgs, we may be things of that sort. So who knows where this is going to end? Right now it's science fiction, but what was science fiction 50 years ago is turning out to be science today. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this brings up your talk also brought up an interesting point too when you mentioned about all the places that we could find life in the solar system, and here we have this sample return mission OSIRIS-REx coming from asteroid Bennu. So, I mean, I can only imagine that robots can only go so far when we send them to Mars and looking around and for evidence of life. But we're actually going to hopefully, if everything's successful, we'll get samples back in the lab. Is there evidence that would be a smoking gun in your mind that panspermia, or that life is pretty readily available in the universe, or that panspermia might have played a really key role in early Earth history that could come back from that Bennu mission? What would we look for?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think, again, it really is very hard to predict where science leads us, right? That's always been very, very hard. But for instance, let's say we go to, 30 years from now, we land on Europa and we actually drill through the ice, and lo and behold, it's full of life. And then the question again becomes, is it life like here on Earth? Is it similar? Is it water carbon based, DNA and protein based? If so, then we'd have to say, okay, this is the only way life can form. It's carbon water based. But if it's different chemistries, then we say, well, that's not the only way, right? And same with anything we might find on Mars. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be panspermia that got life there, But what you could also argue then is when life evolved on those bodies, it used the same chemistry, the same laws of physics and chemistry, the same molecules to pop into life. And if that's the case, then what that German physician Richter predicted 150 years ago is that the cosmos is swarming with life, and that life is going to be ubiquitous and probably all based on the same laws of chemistry and physics that we're based on. But that remains to be seen, obviously.
Yeah,
it's going to be fascinating to find out one way or the other. And even more exciting would, of course, be if we did hear a SETI signal from an advanced civilization. And that would certainly rock everything that we know to its foundation. And hopefully that will happen too before too long, one way or the other.
Yeah, well,
great questions.
Going back to what you mentioned about life possibly having different chemistry, maybe even not even being DNA based. Do we know enough? Do we have a good enough handle on chemistry and biochemistry? I mean, just to be able to see another living life form or understand it if it doesn't use any of the same processes we use?
Yeah, well, some people have argued actually that we should be looking, in fact, for alien organisms here on Earth, because if they run on different biochemistries, for example, and let's say that instead of carbon, they use silicon, as the silicon is a very similar molecule atom to carbon, can form multiple complexes. Then there might be silicon life deep underground in the Earth that we're not even aware exists. And some people have urged we should start looking for that. And I think that's probably a great idea.
Yeah.
The trouble with other things, the reason I'm kind of more pumped up about carbon water is that although silicon is very abundant because the Earth is made of tons and tons of silicon, if that were so handy for life, why didn't silicon life evolve on Earth and dominate it? And carbon is in fact found almost everywhere in the cosmos. It's the fourth most abundant after hydrogen and helium, of course. It's the fourth most abundant element in terms of mass in the cosmos. So it would stand to reason that most life would be carbon-based. Perhaps not necessarily water-based as a solvent, but then water is probably the best solvent we're aware of because it stays liquid over a huge range of temperature, right? So one can make a strong argument that life generally would be carbon water-based. That doesn't necessarily mean it would all be DNA-based because we do know of at least a couple of life things here on Earth that are not DNA-based. And those are the agents, protein-based agents that are like viruses, and they cause mad cow's disease, for example. We have no idea how they propagate and how they travel around. They're just proteins, rogue proteins that can cause this disease. So they're kind of like viruses, but not really, So there's a lot for us to still discover in terms of how broad and how diverse life or near life can be just on our own planet.
We have a lot. We have one last question for you.
All right.
That last question is: if you were a gambling man and you could put your little your bet down on anywhere in the solar system, and this is just for the solar system, where would you say, I don't know, we would have the biggest possibility to find life here in the solar system?
Right. There was a time when I would have said Mars, and then we discovered Europa and Enceladus. But I still go back to Mars because we know for sure that in the distant past, around 3 billion years ago, Mars had a denser atmosphere. Mars had warmer temperature as a result. We know there's lots of water ice on Mars, and there's lots of evidence that, we had canyons and canals and liquid water on Mars, not canals like Lowell, but channels where water flowed. And so if life ever did get a foothold as early on Mars as it is here on Earth, then I would still bet on Mars. What we have to do, of course, is dig beneath the surface now, because it's unlikely that any life could survive on Mars's surface simply because of the intense radiation that hits at ultraviolet would destroy it. But that doesn't mean that life didn't appear on Mars early on, and then as Mars got colder and drier, it developed more and more underground and might still be there today. So I'll go with Mars.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we get some scientists there to kind of answer.
I hope so too.
So Klaus, I want to thank you again. This has been a great talk. Thank you for doing yet another Lowell42 for us and being engaging with our questions, and with the folks that are watching. If you enjoyed this digital programming, Lowell's got another one coming up on November 16th, exactly 4 days and 45 minutes from now. You can watch a live stream of the Leonid meteor shower with Dr. Nick Moskovitz, who's sort of our lead researcher on asteroids and would give lots of great information during that live stream. So please join us for that. That's November 16th. Klaus, thank you. To all our viewers, thank you again.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night and be safe.